welcome everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for tuning in again. I'm R.A. Powell. I'm a children's author. And if people are still tuning in, I can see that I will welcome you at the end. So thank you for tuning. This is the 6th workshop, so thank you so much for sticking with me this far. And just to summarize, you know, this is a 10-week creative writing course, and we are now in week 6. Week 1, we talked about how we can find our inspiration, how we can generate ideas, how we can ingrain writing as a bit of a discipline into our lives. And then in week 2, we talked about characterization, which is the process of creating characters. In week 3, we talked about settings, which is the environment, the world in which our stories are told. And then in week 4, we talked about plot and how we can structure our stories using a framework which I like to call the 7 steps to story structure. And then in week 5, which was last week, we talked about using different forms of narrative voice. So whether we write our stories in first person, so from the perspective of a character, or whether we write them in third person, which is kind of like having an invisible person who is in the story and can watch and listen and observe, and they kind of retell the story to the reader. If you missed any of the workshops, you can watch them back on my Facebook page or my YouTube channel at any time. This week, we're going to talk about dialogue, which is simply how our characters talk to each other. It's the words that our characters say to each other. And, you know, there are some technical elements to this which we'll cover, because there are some specific things when we format dialogue in our stories. So when we're writing it on a computer or on a Word document, for example, there are some things that we can do which follow some rules in terms of how we format the dialogue. So we'll cover that. But mainly we're going to talk about really how we can give our characters an authentic voice. And so today we're going to cover a lot of the different elements from previous workshops, especially characterization. I think I said in workshop 3, I think it was, where, you know, all of these different ingredients that we can use when we write: characterization, settings, plot, dialogue. You know, hopefully now it's clear that we don't see these things and think about these things in isolation. They're all kind of part of the same family. They're all interlinked and entwined, and they overlap. And so you'll see that today with dialogue. It's very much a big part of how we develop characters, but also how we can drive the plot as well. Because the dialogue can really bring our characters to life and can push your story forwards. So we're going to focus on 3 areas of dialogue. And in each of those areas, there will be 3 tips, 3 things that you can consider when writing dialogue and creating a voice for your characters. So there's 3 areas, 3 tips in each. So by the end, you will have 9, let me just take that thumb down, you'll have 9 tips by the end of this session. As always, there will be activities, so 3 different activities which are related to dialogue. So let's begin. Let's start with, I'm going to tell you the 3 areas we're going to talk about today, and then I will talk about each of them in more detail. So number 1 is we're going to talk about giving our characters a voice. So how we develop a voice for our characters. Number 2 is how we make those voices authentic, how we make them sound real, and how we can make our dialogue between characters, how we can make those conversations feel real. And then number 3, we're going to talk about formatting. So how we structure and format the dialogue within a story. So I just saw somebody's birthday there. I missed it, but if someone can say whose birthday it is, I will absolutely give you a big shout out for your birthday. I think it's a birthday tomorrow. I saw. So yes, please do tell me whose birthday it is. So let's start with number 1, is how we can develop a voice for our characters. So dialogue in a story allows our characters to express themselves through speech. It's through the words that they say, and it's the words that we write. Remember, we are the authors. We're in charge. We create the characters. We create the settings. We decide when and where the story takes place. We decide on how the story plays out. And we also decide on what words our characters say in our stories. And we want to give each of our characters their own unique voice. Ultimately, the Holy Grail, I guess, is if you were to take your story and you took out all of the narrative, so all of the parts where there's no dialogue, and then you took out all of the references to who is speaking, which character is speaking, and you just literally had the dialogue in the story, almost like a script, like a film script, a movie script. The Holy Grail would be for the reader to be able to tell who is saying what, just by virtue of the words the character is saying and the manner in which they are saying them. That would be the Holy Grail. That's difficult, but essentially, we want to give each of our characters a unique voice, because we all talk differently, don't we? We have different accents, we have different perspectives, we have different mannerisms, we have different quirks to our speech. We will pronounce certain words differently, because we're all different, and we want to celebrate that difference in our characters' speech and how they talk. So let me just bring back Boris, my example character that I've used through prior weeks. And, Boris, I don't really know Boris as a character, because he isn't a character as such yet. He's just someone who I've used for the activities in the previous workshops. But, if we think about, his mummy told him they're moving to New York, and he ran away in one of the activities. And, I guess for me, Noah... Boris could be quite grumpy. So the words which I would write for Boris to say, would reflect that about how he feels. And so when you are writing your stories and you're developing characters, and then you're writing words for your characters to say in your stories, which is the dialogue, a good exercise to do, which you can do in your spare time at home, is to make a list, write it down, write it down on some paper or on a computer, and write a list of all of your characters, your main characters in your story. And then next to those characters, describe them in a few words. How would you describe each of your characters to somebody if they asked you, what is that character like? What is this character like? How would you describe them? And then from that list, you can then start to brainstorm and think about how they would sound. Imagine if you could meet your characters and you could sit down and have dinner with them, or a cup of coffee, or you could spend time with them. What would it be like to be in their company? What would they sound like when they talk? What's their background? Where are they from? All of these ingredients can form a voice for our character. We don't want all of our characters to kind of talk and sound the same in our stories, because there's going to be very little kind of dynamic between the characters. And so, that's a really good exercise that you can do at home, either with a story that you're currently writing and you haven't finished, or even with a story that you've kind of finished, but you're still kind of putting the finishing touches on. Just make a list of the key characters in your story, and then describe them in a few words, 4 or 5 words each, and then from there, kind of think about how their accent or their voice could sound. So for example, some characters may shout, some characters may whisper and talk very quietly, some characters may always speak in slang, some characters may be very posh and well spoken, some characters may stutter or have some kind of speech impediment. Some characters may talk in very long sentences and talk forever and ever and ever and ramble on and on and on. Or some characters may be of few words and keep it quite choppy and to the point. Some characters may have a catchphrase, which, so all of these things provide a kind of identity, a voice identity of that character. So for example, this is another Boris, not the Boris I've used in the previous workshops, and not Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, but I've got 2 characters in my first book, Odd Socks, who are boxer shorts. They're called Bill and Boris. And I kind of moulded them on Ant and Dec a little bit, because they're best buddies, they kind of bounce off each other, they're witty, they're funny, but they always say old bean. They call each other old bean. It's an affectionate term that they use for each other, but also for their friends. And that term old bean is kind of part of their identity. It's part of who they are. And so in their dialogue, they'll often say old bean, and they have a particular way of expressing themselves. And so these are the things we can think about when we develop characters, and it gives them that extra layer of depth to it as well. So a really good idea is to do that, is to kind of sit down, write down the names of your characters, describe, what type of person or character they are. And then from there, you can then brainstorm some ideas and just think. It's kind of like living with your characters in your head and spending a bit of time with them. Imagining what they would be like, how they would carry themselves, how they would talk, and what that would sound like. So 3 tips that you can think about when developing a voice for your character. So number 1 is what I've just said, is kind of get to know your characters. You will know them better than anybody else because you have created them. Because remember, you are the author and you have created these characters. And before you did that, they didn't exist, but now they do. And so, try and get to know them further by kind of imagining what it would be like to spend time with them, having a conversation with them, and kind of write some kind of notes down. Again, we're just building this archive, this library of ideas and your imagination. It's kind of taking your imagination from here and getting it down on paper. So remember, do they shout? Do they have an accent? Do they have a catchphrase? Do they have a particular way of saying things? Where are they from? The crucial thing is, who are they as characters? Who are they? So that's number 1. Number 2, another tip to think about, or another thing to do when we develop we're developing voices for our characters, is to be consistent. So once we have developed a voice for our character, so our character has a particular way of expressing themselves and has a particular turn of phrase, we want to keep that consistent throughout the story. There is a caveat to that. So everything I say, there is a caveat. There could be a Basically, it could be the opposite of what I say. So you may well write a story where something really sinister or something major happens to one of your characters, and from that, as a result, they talk completely differently. So that would be the caveat. But generally speaking, once we've developed a voice for our character, we want that voice to be consistent throughout the story. So it makes sense, and the character stays with the reader. And then number 3 is, kind of just think about people in your life, whether that's people you know personally, so whether it's friends, aunties, uncles, classmates, teachers, whether it's people, celebrities, or people you see on the TV or on the movies, or people you read about in newspapers or you watch on the news. We can take inspiration from the world around us, and we can take little snippets of different people's personalities and mold them into something new for our characters. So you may well remember an old teacher from years ago who used to say, had a particular phrase that they used to say, and you think that might suit one of your characters. Or there may be, a famous person that you watch on TV who reminds you of one of your characters, and you can then think about what you could take from that famous person and build it into your character. So that's 3 things to think about when developing voices for our characters. Number 1 is get to know them. So imagine spending time with them and imagine what their voice would sound like, how they would talk. Number 2, once we've done that, is to be consistent through the story, and keep that kind of tone of voice consistent to the end. And then number 3 is to just, take from the world around us, people who we know in our lives, and be inspired by them. I have lots of my characters. I take names from old teachers or old colleagues I used to work with, and then combine them with another name. Turns of phrase I like to use, from people or from films. The world is there. It's like a buffet of ideas, and we just have to go in there and take the ideas that we like and join them with other ideas, and they create something fresh and new. So I'm hoping this is making sense so far. Please shout if it isn't. So once we've done that, we've established who our characters really are, and then we've developed a bit of a unique voice for that character. Then we can now start to think about how our characters can sound real, and some things we can do to make them sound real. First, let's have an activity. And this activity is just to illustrate how different characters could potentially say the kind of same thing, but differently. So it's the same sentiment, but different characters would express it in a different way, using different words. So the sentence, so I would like you to write as many different ways you can think of in the same comment, if you can, this is the sentiment. I think this is great. I think this is great. So that's the sentiment. You want your character to be saying, I think this is great, but what other different ways could a character express that sentence? So it could be super duper or smashing, or write that down. And I always love to read out the examples of your examples of the activity. So I will do that in a few moments. So have a think about that. And again, this is just to illustrate that there's so many different ways that characters can express the same thing. So when you've got dialogue in your story, what are the other ways that the character could express those words, which would kind of bring it to life a bit more and be more in keeping with the character who is speaking, who is saying those words. So we've now kind of developed voices for our characters. We've gave them an accent, or we've gave them a particular phrase, or a particular way of expressing themselves, or a manner in which they express themselves. Now we just want to make sure that sounds authentic. So number 2 is to kind of how we can make our dialogue sound real. Because in real life, we all talk differently, and we kind of want to reflect that. Even if your characters may not be human, you may be writing a story like my first book, Odd Socks. The main characters, there's human beings in it, but the main characters are socks, boxer shorts, ties, belts, hair grips. But we still, even though they're not human, we still want them to sound authentic and relatable. And we want the words that they say to sound real, but also the way they speak to each other. So the conversations between characters flow naturally, so that it doesn't sound too robotic. So if you spend time just listening to people around you, so whether you're at home and you listen to your parents or close family members or carers or whoever you live with, if anybody, then just listen to them talk sometimes, and listen to the conversation, not in a nosy way, but just listen to how each of those people express themselves. And you can do the same in a supermarket, or you could do the same at school if you're in the playground when you go back to school, that is. And what you'll soon discover is that almost everybody, regardless of where they're from or how old they are, or their background, everyone has a little quirk to their speech. What I mean by that is, almost nobody speaks so fluently and fluidly, and everybody pauses or hesitates or will say I always say all the time. I've just did it there again. So everybody has these little quirks to their speech. Everybody stumbles occasionally on their words, or perhaps pronounces a word incorrectly or differently to others. And that's because we're human beings, we're not robots. And unless you are writing a story about robots, which you may well be, in which case you may want them to sound kind of robotic, generally, if we've got characters who we want to kind of feel relatable to our readers, then we want their speech to kind of not be perfect, so it sounds real. We want to include those imperfections. So it's perfectly fine if our characters don't speak perfect English or the Queen's English, and pronounce every single word perfectly and clearly, because that's just not the case in real life when people are speaking to each other. And of course, if in your story you may well have a particular chapter or a scene where your character might be in a challenging or scary or high pressure situation, a situation which they may not have been in before, and they're probably not going to speak calmly and slowly and pronounce every single word correctly, or they're probably going to be in a state of shock or panic or fear. And when we're in a state of shock or panic or fear, we'll talk differently. So again, it's just thinking about the context in which the dialogue is taking place and ensuring that it stays true to that context. So something we can further do on that. So for example, you can just include in your dialogue, if one of your characters is unsure of themselves, they may well kind of stumble on their words, or they may say, or pause a lot. And you can include that in your dialogue. You know, you can include literally, you know, I think this is, or you should absolutely include that, because it will make it much more real. And another way we can do that further is, and to make our dialogue sound real, is to use what we call tags. Tags, so that's T-A-G, tag. So a dialogue tag. So a tag is what we use as authors after a line of dialogue. And it signifies who has just spoken. So the example I used in the activity, I think this is great, that is the dialogue. But then if I added said Boris at the end, that's the tag. Said Boris is the tag. Now, there's nothing wrong with having in your stories said Boris, said Tony, said Jenny, said Susie. There's nothing wrong with that. And you will find in many books that you read and that you've loved and enjoyed, that it will often say said, said name of character, said name of character. There's nothing wrong with that. However, we can elevate the dialogue even further by kind of building on the tag and by using different descriptions. So let me use that example there. I think this is great, said Boris. So that kind of just says to the reader, Boris thinks whatever it is great, and he said those words. But actually, if instead we say, I think this is great, beamed Boris, that changes the whole complexion of that sentence. We immediately can imagine Boris kind of, you know, with a big smile on his face, he's super happy, and it lifts that line of dialogue just by changing that word from said to beamed in the tag. So again, you know, if you've already written a story, it's well worth having a look at the dialogue in your story and just having a look at the tags that you use. You know, if a lot of it is said Jenny, said Tony, said Susie, said Boris, then, you know, think about different ways, different tags you can use. So instead of said all the time, it could be beamed, it could be whispered, it could be screamed, it could be cried. You know, there's so many different ways you can describe how our characters are communicating and saying those words. Then we can go a bit further and build on that tag some more by adding a bit of a description around what the character is doing at that moment. And it could be a facial expression, it could be, you know, a kind of their posture, or it could be the way their body language, or it could be a physical movement. You know, they could be doing something as they say those words. So for example, I could, instead of I think this is great, said Boris, I could instead write, Boris jumped up and down. I think this is great, he cried. So what we've done there is we've added, before the actual dialogue, before those words, I think this is great, we've added a description of something that Boris is doing. He's jumping up and down. He is, it sounds like, it feels like that he is very happy. And he thinks whatever it is great. And he's cried it. He hasn't just said it. He's cried, I think this is great. So Boris is obviously very happy. And so you see, just by using such examples occasionally within your dialogue, it kind of just takes it to another level. And you know, for many of you, you may well know this all already. Apologies if you do, and it's but for some of you who don't, it is definitely something that you can look at within your writing and just implement pretty quickly. Hopefully this is making sense. And then we can also use kind of body language or facial expressions too. on that. And again, this builds on characterization by playing with, you know, the character's physical appearance. So, you know, with Boris, I mean, I have no idea what Boris looks like because he's this made-up character, and I haven't really spent any time with Boris like I suggest you do with your characters. But, you know, kind of this sentence of, I think this is great, said Boris, could be, I think this is great, said Boris, his blue eyes twinkling or sparkling. So again, you know, we can use those different physical characteristics of a character to add on to the tag. So quite a lot of information here. Hope it's making sense. Just to recap those points and give you 3 items to consider, or tips to consider when writing dialogue to make it sound authentic, because that is what we want to achieve. You know, we don't have 2 children in a class speaking to each other all the time, politely and you know, quietly and in perfect English. It just doesn't happen. You know, we all speak to each other differently depending on the environment in which we are in, the situation we're in, and who we're speaking to. And so we want to try and reflect that. So 3 tips is, number 1 is absolutely include quirks in speech. So stumbling on words or pauses, or, you know, speech impediments if your character has one, or their accent, or particular turns of phrase, or ways of pronouncing particular words. Absolutely include these quirks in your character's speech, because we're not robots and we don't want our characters to sound like robots unless you are writing a story about robots. That's number 1. Number 2 is to use tags to great effect. So tags, instead of saying said and then the character's name, you know, we can use alternative words. We can use whispered, screamed, cried, hissed, howled. You know, there's so many different options, and it's important that we choose the right one to really convey to the reader how the character feels at that moment in the story when they're saying those words. And then number 3 is to make use of body language and expression. So posture, eye contact, facial expressions, hand movements like that, mannerisms. These are all things that we could incorporate into our dialogue to make them sound more real and really build on, you know, developing our characters. Let's have an activity. So this is activity part 2. I'm conscious of time, actually. I think I've rambled on quite a bit now, so I'll rattle through the final part, which is around formatting of dialogue. So let's have a look. I would like you to write as many different ways as you can how you could write this sentence. Boris, will you come here, please? So Boris, will you come here, please? What other ways could you write that? So same sentiment. You want the character to try and instruct Boris to come to them, but what other ways could you say that? And you could write that down on paper and on the comments. And I will pick out some comments towards the end. Right, number 3, let's quickly cover this. And this is about formatting dialogue. So when we're writing our stories, you know, we're going to write them on some paper, or we may probably write them on a computer, which is generally what I do. And, you know, there's a certain way, you know, when you read, have a look at the books that you love and you read, have a look at the way the author formats the dialogue. And there's lots of authors use different ways, slightly different variations of each other. But it's important that we do present it in a way which, so that the dialogue is it's easy to see when somebody is speaking versus when it's just kind of plain narrative. And so there's three things that I'm going to cover. One is quotation marks. So, you know, at the beginning and end of the dialogue, so the words the character says, there are quotation marks. So they could look like little 66s or little 99s. And in some books, some authors use single marks rather than double. But we should always start and finish our dialogue with those quotation marks, because otherwise we will not know when a character is talking versus the narrative. So that's crucial. We've got to do that. Have a look at the books you read and see what that looks like, and see which authors use double bubbles, little quotation bubbles, or whether they use single. Generally speaking as well, number two is when there's a new character speaks within the story, they generally get a brand new paragraph. So, you know, if you look at the last book that you've read, or look at the book that you're reading right now, and just look at how the dialogue is structured and formatted in the actual book. When a character speaks, they will have their own kind of paragraph, their own line or paragraph, depending on the number of words they say and kind of what they're doing. And then when another character responds, it will be a new paragraph. Sometimes it's indented. Some authors do that. Some authors don't. I'm not sure if there's a specific right or wrong answer. My books are generally indented, new paragraph, when a new character is now talking. So that's something. So you don't just join all of the dialogue together, because then it would be difficult for the reader to see when a different character is talking. It would be difficult for them to make out who is saying what and when. And then finally, and this is just a simple one, is just to make sure that you let the reader know who is speaking. Don't always assume that the reader knows who is saying those words. Sometimes it can be obvious. Sometimes you may just have two characters in a scene. And so if they're in a bit of a deep conversation, then you don't necessarily need to always say their name after each line of dialogue. But sometimes it's not so obvious. And sometimes we've always got to remember not to assume that our reader knows who is speaking. So sometimes we've got to make it clear. So always just check that. And this is, I'll touch upon this probably next week when we talk about editing and so forth. It's always good to have your writing checked by a family friend. I think I've said this in previous weeks. By someone you know, someone you trust, someone who will give you constructive feedback, because they will pick out these things, these glaringly obvious things, but you wouldn't necessarily notice them because you're ingrained in your story. You're in that bubble because you're in it. You've been writing it for so long. So that's three things on how we format dialogue. You could run a whole session just on that, on the real kind of technical stuff, and it would be pretty boring and pretty dry. I wouldn't personally enjoy it. The best piece of advice I can give you is just to look at the books that you love, look at how they structure and format the dialogue in them, and kind of just copy that. It's a simple thing to do. So, but you can always Google stuff on that as well. So that is it, and it's 1:45 now, so I've actually ran bang on time, but I did promise questions. Hopefully that makes sense. Let me have a look at some great examples there. Let me pick some out quickly. If you do have any questions, let me talk. I'll talk about the 1,000 word story and the future workshops in a second. Let me just pick out a couple of examples on the second activity, which was how you could describe the sentiment of Boris, can you come here, please? So let's have a look. So this is from Jennifer. I know it's not Jennifer, but sorry, Jennifer. I know, remind me who it actually is on there as well. Grumpily, I wandered down the stairs. I mean, who wouldn't be annoyed? I just broke up with my boyfriend. Half sobbing, I called, Boris, come here. My voice faded out. I sighed sadly. Fantastic. Brilliant. You know, that is how much elaboration on that simple sentiment of Boris, will you come here? You know, Jennifer has built around that a whole background story. You know, that's fantastic. Brilliant. And I'm sorry, I think it might not be Jennifer. It is, it's Averill. Averill. Well done, Averill. Fantastic. Let's have a look. Yo, Boris, get over here. That's from Marie. Love it. Nice and simple, straight to the point, direct. It's got a bit of venom there, or it could be in a kind of jovial. It could be a bit jokey and fun. Yo, Boris, get over here. Love it. But again, you know, you can imagine that rather than Boris, will you come here, please? Boris, will you come here, please is pretty straightforward. But when you say, yo, Boris, get over here, it kind of brings it to a different level. Now, of course, whoever was saying that, you would want it to feel that wouldn't be Boris's teacher, probably not. Or maybe it was a very strict and authoritative teacher, perhaps. But again, let's have a look. Yolanda, Boris, come here right now, with big capital letters. Fantastic. So again, real expression there. And then there's a completely different one from Joe. Boris, can you come here a second, please, my darling? Mum says cheerfully. So a completely different way of saying it. And fantastic. So you can see this, and a lot of this is probably obvious and you probably already know, but sometimes it's just good to kind of reflect on the things that we know, and just think about those things and think about how we can apply them to our writing.